Hey guys, what's up? It's time for your last minute tips for the AP exam. Keep all these things in mind, and hopefully, if you do what we've practiced, you're going to do well. First, let's talk about the argumentative essay. I think the first thing that I want to mention is that you need to identify your thesis and line of reasoning clearly. That means you need to have a because statement. So the question might ask you something along the lines of which governmental entity is more capable or deserves more credit for protecting minority rights or for advancing equality. And they might ask you to choose between the state and the federal governments. You need to provide an answer and then say why. Because. If you don't have the because statement, you won't be able to earn most of the rest of the points. The second thing I want to mention is that you need to be specific and clear when you describe and explain your two pieces of evidence. Don't leave anything for guesswork for the graders. Be very clear in describing and explaining. Both of those words are important. I think each body paragraph should be about 3 sentences. You need to describe the piece of evidence that you are writing about. So, you need to talk about it specifically and explain how it connects back to your thesis. What is the piece of evidence? Why is it related to the central argument that you're making? And then how does it support your argument? One of the best ways to do that would be to give an example. Okay, so if you're talking about Federalist 10, and if you're talking about how Madison was arguing against factions, what are some of the factions that have existed in the United States in the past that perhaps haven't been able to get that sort of majority rule where they've been able to oppress the rights of other factions? Give those examples. Be specific and clear, and don't leave anything for doubt. All right. Now let's talk about the concept application essay. They're going to give you a scenario and you're going to have to respond to that. We've practiced this. First of all, piece of advice, don't get overwhelmed by the scenario. You might not initially understand or recognize every single detail that's in there. Slow down, take a breath, and you can work your way through it. You need to identify what are the big core course concepts or institutions that are being discussed in the scenario. Maybe they've named a bureaucratic agency and you initially aren't familiar with it. But if you can identify that that's part of the bureaucracy, you're probably good to go to answer that rest of that question. Maybe they're going to be talking about the Supreme Court confirmation process and they're going to talk about a specific judge. And you might not know the name of that particular judge, you might not recall. As long as you can understand that this is about the Supreme Court confirmation process, you're probably going to be good to go. So make sure you don't get overwhelmed. Next piece of evidence I want to say is make sure that when you answer the question, you follow the prompts clearly. If they ask you to describe and explain something, that's more than just to identify it. You need at least a couple of sentences for each of the prompts in order to make sure you're going into enough detail. And they're most likely to ask you to refer back to the scenario or provide context that was given in the scenario that helps you explain your answer. So make sure you do that. Refer back to what the scenario was asking about or the scenario prompt that is being described, and that will help demonstrate your understanding of the prompt. So be detailed, be clear, and be specific. Remember, this is open notes. So make sure you use your materials and look up material quickly, have it readily available. And that moves us to the next section of this video, your notes and what you should have out. Because this is an open note exam, you might be feeling a little more confident and a little less overwhelmed, and that's fine. But let me remind you that most of your time should be spent writing your responses, not looking up answers. That being said, you should have some key items clearly organized and readily available so you can grab them as a quick reference check on the fly. The first is you should have notes about each of the primary documents. You've had a list of that. We've gone over all of them. I've made review videos on all of them. Make sure you understand what the core idea is, what unit were we studying it in, how might this come up, what ideas is this document talking about. That way you can make sure you can do a quick check, make sure you're on the right track, make sure you're talking about the right things. The next thing I want to point out is that you should have each of the primary cases that are required by the College Board written down in note form in a nice organized place or chart. Although they're not going to have the Supreme Court case study question, that doesn't mean that they might not refer to a Supreme Court case, ask you to talk about potentially in a scenario application question, or I should point out the Supreme Court cases are pieces of evidence that you could use in your answers for the argument essay. So you should have those readily available as well. And finally, I want to point out you should have a copy of the U.S. Constitution or some way to access directly what all of the articles and provisions are in the Constitution as well as each of the amendments. First of all, you should obviously be familiar with all of this already, but it's good to have that quickly and readily available as a quick check to make sure you're not mixing up your amendments or mixing up your articles or any core concepts. What you're not going to have time to do is get bogged down and read Article 1 or look for specific sections in Article 2, but make sure you can do quick reference checks on the main points of the Constitution. But that being said, going into it, you should know what each of the 7 articles are and the constitutional amendments are anyway, but it'll give you a little more confidence to be able to refer back to different provisions and make sure you're on the right track. Keep in mind also, one of the foundational documents that you can use as evidence in your argument essay is the United States Constitution. If you choose to do that, then be specific about what provision of the Constitution you're referring to and why it helps support your argument. Those notes I've just discussed, that's a minimum. You can have all your other notes available as well, but if you do, make sure they're in a nice, neat, organized fashion by unit. Like I said, you don't want to be wasting critical time flipping through pages of notes. You want to have those basic required things available. And if you really are in a position where you feel like you need to look something up, you have to know where exactly to look. So perhaps you want to have a large table of some sort, something where you can lay things out in different places, and so you know exactly where my documents are, where my court cases are, and where my unit notes and flashcards are, so on and so forth. You don't want to be flipping through all over the place. Try to find a quiet environment to take this test. Try to take a deep breath before you start. You've put in a lot of work. You've prepared really hard. You've done practice questions. We've gotten feedback on those things. We've had conversations. You guys are really smart, intelligent, capable students, and I know you have the ability to do well. So, believe in yourself. Make sure that you prepare yourself so that you can do the best you possibly can at 4 o'clock on this exam. Have everything ready. Be in a suitable environment. Don't let anything else get in the way. Do your best, and I wish you all the best, and I believe in you. Good luck.